All right, so get ready to dive into Trump's economic game plan. We're talking tariffs, trade wars, the whole shebang. You've given us a ton of sources to unpack, all focused on his economic strategies for the 2024 election. And it seems like you really want to get beyond those attention-grabbing headlines and really dissect the why behind his ideas.
Yeah, and it's fascinating how these sources reveal the core of Trump's economic philosophy. It's not just about like numbers and policies, it's about national identity, almost a sort of economic Darwinism, you could say.
Right, it's that classic art of the deal Trump we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like, remember that story he tells about the car factories almost moving to Mexico? He practically takes credit for single-handedly scaring those companies into staying put with his tariff threats.
Oh, absolutely. That story gets right to the heart of it. It's the perfect example of his protectionist approach in action. The logic, at least as he sees it, is pretty straightforward. You slap tariffs on goods made overseas, and companies have a choice to make. Either they eat the cost or they bring those jobs back to America. And in theory, everyone wins. Domestic production goes up, unemployment goes down.
Sounds good, right?
Sure, on paper, maybe. But then he takes it a step further, right? He suggests that we can basically use tariffs like a weapon in global currency markets. Keep the dollar strong, outmaneuver China. It's a bold strategy, to say the least. But is it actually realistic?
That's where things get a bit complicated. I mean, there's no doubt that tariffs can influence trade, but using them to control something as complex as global finance, well, it's a bit like trying to perform surgery with a chainsaw. It's incredibly risky. We could easily see retaliation from other countries, trade wars, basically the very economic chaos he claims he's trying to prevent. It's a tightrope walk, that's for sure. And speaking of delicate situations, the sources you've shared on immigration paint an interesting picture, too. It's not just about building walls. There's a very real economic angle to his approach as well.
Absolutely. This is where we see a real clash between conventional economic thinking and the Trump approach. He's acknowledged that curbing immigration might actually shrink the U.S. economy in the short term, but he seems prepared to accept that.
It's like he's saying a slightly smaller pie is a price I'll pay for tighter border control. It's pretty stark contrast to those economists who argue that immigration actually fuels economic growth.
100%. They'd point to the vital role immigrants play in filling labor gaps, bringing new ideas, and ultimately boosting GDP. But for Trump, concerns about national security and preserving what he sees as American culture outweigh those potential economic gains.
And he doesn't mince words, calling the situation at the border an invasion. He even suggests using the Criminal Aliens Act from 1798, which is, like, older than the country itself, to take swift action if he's reelected. What are the implications of relying on something so old, so seemingly irrelevant today?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, even if it's just a negotiating tactic, it raises serious questions about executive power and potential overreach. But it really underscores just how much importance he places on immigration reform, even if it ruffles some feathers along the way.
It's wild, right? It's like he's speaking a different language sometimes, but people seem to get it. It's fascinating how he takes these complex issues and makes them sound so simple, so relatable. I'm curious about something, though. You pointed out how Trump's speeches are packed with these captivating tangents, like that story about haggling over the price of Air Force One. Do you think these sidetracks distract from his message, or are they strategically placed, like part of some grand narrative?
That's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of how Trump communicates. Those seemingly random anecdotes, those tangents, they often loop back to reinforce his main points. Like, take the Air Force One story, it plays directly into this image he's cultivated as a master negotiator, the guy who cuts through bureaucracy and always gets the best deal, especially for the average American.
Right. It's like he wants us to see everything as a negotiation, and he's the ultimate deal maker. And it's not just about those specific deals, is it? He uses those relatable stories, almost like folk tales, to illustrate his view of America. A nation in peril, a system rigged against the hardworking majority. He's sending the message that he's the only one who can fix it.
Exactly. And that message, delivered with that classic Trump flair, resonates incredibly strongly with his base. It tapped into this very real feeling that the system is broken, that politicians are out of touch, and that it would take an outsider, someone with Trump's business experience, to shake things up. It's a compelling narrative, no doubt about it.
Sure, but how much of it is actually doable? He talks about slashing energy costs in half, bringing back manufacturing jobs like it's the good old days before NAFTA. Are these realistic goals, or are we in campaign promise territory?
Well, that's where we need to separate the achievable with the right policies from the aspirational, a rallying cry for his supporters. Now, while some promises might be difficult to fully realize because the global economy is just so complex, they tap into a very real fear many people have about being left behind, about their economic security.
Absolutely. And it's like he's speaking directly to those voters who feel ignored, overlooked. It's a message of, I see you, I understand your frustration, and I'm here to fight for you. And in today's climate, that's a powerful message.
Absolutely. That feeling of shared struggle, that understanding is crucial to understanding Trump's enduring appeal. He's a master at portraying himself as the champion of the everyday American who feels forgotten, the one willing to challenge the status quo and shake things up.
It's certainly a bold strategy, there's no denying that, but it makes you wonder how much of what we're hearing is about real, concrete economic policy,
Yeah.
and how much is about creating a story. A story that really resonates with people's fears and hopes.
It really is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Ultimately, it's up to each voter to decide. Trump's economic vision is this interesting mix of traditional Republican ideas, tax cuts, less regulation, but interwoven with this populist protectionist thread. It's a unique approach, and whether it will work for him in 2024 is yet to be seen. One thing's for sure, though. It's going to be a fascinating election.
You've given us a lot to think about. You also highlighted parts in these sources where his own words seem to contradict his broader message.
Hmm.
Like, he's highly critical of companies moving jobs overseas, but then practically brags about encouraging one to move to Mexico. It's a bit of a head scratcher.
It is interesting, isn't it? And it highlights a really important aspect of how Trump operates. His pragmatism often wins out over rigid ideology. He might criticize outsourcing in general, but he's not opposed to making exceptions if he thinks it serves a larger purpose, like getting a better deal in a trade negotiation or maybe rewarding a company he sees as an ally.
So it's less about sticking to a rigid set of principles and more about getting the best outcome in the moment, whatever that might be.
Exactly. He's a master at playing all sides, adapting to the situation. This makes it tough to pin down his exact stance on specific issues, which can be frustrating but also really fascinating.
It's a new way of approaching economic policy, that's for sure. One we haven't really seen before. It makes me wonder how much of what we're hearing is really about concrete policy that can be put into action and how much is about crafting a narrative, right? A story that resonates with people's fears and aspirations.
That is the ultimate question, isn't it? And ultimately, it's a judgment every voter has to make for themselves. Trump's economic vision blends traditional Republican ideas like tax cuts and deregulation with a more populist protectionist approach. It's going to be fascinating to see if this approach resonates with voters in 2024. Whatever happens, it will be a fascinating race to follow.
This is really fascinating stuff. We've covered so much ground: tariffs, trade wars, immigration. We've looked at it all through this lens of what we might call Trump economics. As we head into this next election cycle, what do you think is the most important thing for our listeners to keep in mind?
It's a really good question. To understand the real impact of Trump's economic strategies, you have to look past the surface. It's not just about the policies themselves. It's about how they're presented, the stories they tell, the way they tap into people's emotions.
Like we've been talking about, understanding Trump's economics means understanding Trump, the man, the deal maker, the showman.
Right. And that's what makes these sources so insightful. It's not just what he says, it's how he says it. And importantly, why it resonates with so many voters.
This has given us a lot to think about. I hope our listeners feel the same. This whole interplay of narrative and policy, the tension between being pragmatic and ideological, it's complex.
For sure. If I could leave everyone with one thought, it's that you can't easily categorize Trump's economic thinking. It's not just left or right. It's this unique mix of protectionism, this focus on America first, and always that deal-making mentality. Whether you agree with his methods or not, he has this incredible ability to connect with the anxieties people are feeling. And that's a powerful force in any election.
Absolutely. Well, you've given us a lot to watch out for as the 2024 campaign gets into full swing. It'll be really interesting to see how these economic issues play out.
And beyond that, how these economic concerns continue to shake things in the years to come, regardless of who wins.
That's a great point and a good place to wrap up. It's been great talking with you. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.